Hello and welcome to this video podcast for biology. Hello and welcome to this video podcast for human genetics. In the last podcast, we talked about sexual identity, sexual development, and we compared the X and the Y chromosomes. And we reviewed some terms associated with why XX individuals are typically female and why XY individuals are typically male. In this podcast, we're going to talk about some exceptions to that. Some exceptions to whether or not XX is always female or XY is always male. And then we'll talk about the genetic evidence for homosexuality, and we'll talk about sex ratios. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to talk about some exceptions to XY equals male and XX equals female. Earlier, I mentioned XX individuals are usually female and XY individuals are usually male. However, what I'd like to talk about on this board is that sometimes XX individuals are male. And the main way this can happen is when dad, I'll draw dad here, when he makes his gametes, his sperm, usually what happens is for every spermatogonium is he will produce from that one spermatogonium 4 sperm. And 2 of them will have the X chromosome in it, and 2 will have the smaller Y chromosome in it. However, during meiosis, the X and the Y chromosome pair up with each other during prophase. And crossing over can occur between the X and Y chromosome so that some of the information from the Y chromosome can move to the X or from the X to the Y. And we won't go into gory details about how that happens, but I would like you to know that sometimes he could produce a sperm that had the X chromosome on it, but also a part of the Y chromosome on it. And if the part of the Y chromosome that came over contained the SRY gene, then this X chromosome would allow an XX individual to become male. So in reality, this XX individual here, we probably would be better off calling him XX plus SRY. Typically, people will be XX plus SRY. They'll grow up male, and they won't realize that they have 2 X chromosomes until they go for some testing. Often individuals who are XX plus SRY tend to be sterile. And so sometimes they'll go in for fertility treatments, and that's when they'll discover that they are XX. Next, I'd like to talk about why sometimes XY individuals are female. There are several ways this could happen. We're going to talk about 3 ways. Only one way on this whiteboard, and then I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about the other 2 ways. So the first way is that when a man makes their sperm, and again, we said he would make 4 gametes per spermatogonium. He would have 2 gametes, 2 sperm with an X chromosome in it, and then he would have 2 gametes with a Y chromosome in it. And sometimes a Y-bearing sperm, I'm going to draw a little bit bigger here, we'll put plus SRY on it. In fact, usually it does, but sometimes he could make a Y-bearing sperm with SRY mutated. And if that happens, the sperm that would make this XY individual here would develop as a female. Often, a female who is XY wouldn't know that she's XY unless she went in for some kind of testing and they did a karyotype on her. And then they determined that indeed she was XY. Now, sadly, as in with the XX males, the XY female is also sterile. And there's very little that they can do to reverse that. I didn't mention it before, but if you catch it early enough with an XX male, you can reverse the sterility with hormone treatments. However, even with this, like I said, you have to do this early before puberty, and it has a fairly low rate of success. Okay, let's move on to the other 2 examples of XY female. Okay, I'd like to talk about 2 other syndromes. The first one is something called androgen insensitivity syndrome. Often it is just referred to as AIS. All right, so let's talk about AIS. Individuals who are AIS have an X and Y chromosome. Now, in these individuals, the testes don't fully develop and don't descend. They stay in the abdomen. At puberty, their breasts grow and develop. Usually there's little or no pubic hair or armpit hair. At birth, and really for their life, they appear female and are raised as such. And most identify as being female. So how is it possible they could be XY yet appear female? I should also tell you that the SRY gene is not mutated. In fact, these individuals will take the SRY gene and still make lots of testosterone. But here's where the problem comes in. The cells that respond to testosterone have a receptor on them. And so usually what happens is testosterone binds to these receptors, and when they bind to these receptors, various activities occur that activate pathways to lead to the formation of male sex organs. Individuals with AIS, however, so let's draw this here, put AIS in front of it, on top of it. Again, they make lots of testosterone. However, there's no receptor. If there's no receptor to bind to activate male sex development, the testosterone is unable to bind and activate. So lots of testosterone, but nothing to do with it. Turns out that this gene is on the X chromosome. So the AIS gene that makes this receptor, so I'm going to write AIS receptor that binds testosterone, is on the X chromosome. Now, a question you might want to consider and debate with your friends and family is this. Does someone with androgen insensitivity syndrome who has an elevated level of testosterone, should they be allowed to compete in women's Olympic events? Or should they compete as males? Or should they not be allowed to compete? This is not a fictional case study. There are cases like this that have actually happened, and they had to decide whether or not these individuals who are XY, they appear female, they've been raised as females, they identify as females, but they technically have testes, and they make a lot of testosterone. Something to think about. Next, I would like to talk about 5-alpha reductase deficiency. 5-alpha reductase deficiency is a form of pseudohermaphrodism. In simple terms, this means the presence of male and female structures at different stages. These individuals who have 5-alpha reductase deficiency are XY. They have a functional SRY gene. This is where it gets a little different. They have male reproductive structures that develop, but remain inside. As a result, they appear female and are raised female. That is until puberty, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But the question I want to talk about right now is, why is it that male reproductive structures that form stay on the inside? One of the structures doesn't form. Put that over here and say the penis doesn't form. And that's because this 5-alpha reductase, which I'm just going to call AR, is needed for timely penis development. Now, something interesting happens. At puberty, these individuals will make more testosterone and go through what appears to be male puberty. Their voice deepens, they begin to grow facial hair, their muscles become more defined, and they have a more, in general, a more masculine physique. They don't develop breasts, they don't begin to menstruate, and what they thought was their clitoris enlarges. and becomes a penis. So this is a very fascinating syndrome. Even more interesting is that these individuals will begin to produce sperm and are fertile and can have children. In case you were wondering, a person can be XX with 5-alpha reductase deficiency, and these individuals appear female, are raised as females typically, and don't go through this conversion because they don't have the Y chromosome. So if they have two X chromosomes, usually there's not any significant phenotype associated with them. Now, how these individuals are treated in society often depends upon where they live. Your book describes this story from the Dominican Republic, where in the 1970s there were 22 XY individuals born with this deficiency. And they were raised as girls, but at puberty they became their sons. From the story, it appears that the parents didn't really have a negative reaction to this. Many of the parents were actually happy because in that society they had a preference towards having sons. We can debate whether or not that's good or bad, but that is how they felt. And it turns out they were fully accepted as males in the rest of the community as well. It should also be noted that within this region of the Dominican Republic, there are a higher percentage of individuals with this deficiency because it's an isolated community and you have a greater chance of reproducing with somebody who is a blood relative, like a first or second cousin. Now, of course, some societies would not have been as accepting. So it all depends upon the relative acceptance of a particular society on how various mutations will be accepted. Okay, let's move on to a new topic. And I'm going to introduce this topic with a question. And that question is homosexuality inherited? Are there any factors that suggest sexual orientation is a heritable trait? Now, this is an interesting question because society and history also play into this to some extent. Back when I was a kid, if somebody asked this question, most people would have argued that homosexuality did not have any heritable traits. However, society has moved a little bit from back when I was a kid, and the science is also now there to support it as well. So what I'd like to do on this whiteboard here is just to provide some of the evidence that supports homosexuality is a heritable trait. Now, often we may not know why we feel one way or another, or why we're attracted to one gender and not another gender, or why we might be attracted to both genders. But what we do know is that these feelings are real and they're intense. So here is some evidence to support the heritability of homosexuality. We see it in all human cultures and for thousands of years. It's not just a new trend. In addition, homosexuality has been documented in greater than 500 different species. We see it in different primates, including humans. We see it in dolphins. We see it in lions and tigers. We see it all over the place. Twin studies support a genetic, or you might say heritable, link to homosexuality. In addition, these same twin studies also supports an environmental link. We'll talk more about twin studies and how they are interpreted in a podcast or two from now. So there's evidence of both a genetic and an environmental link, which is true of almost all other behaviors as well. Since twin studies support this genetic link, what are the genes? Well, we've known for a few decades anyhow that there are genetic components on the X chromosome. So that what they would do here is they looked at identical twins. And again, we'll talk more about twin studies later on. But they looked at identical twins, and they looked at twins where both were homosexual. And they looked at identical twins where both were heterosexual. And they compared their chromosomes. The identical twins who were homosexual had similar regions on the X chromosome. Same is true with the twins that were heterosexual. They also had similar regions on the X chromosome, but they weren't the same. These similarities were only found amongst the homosexual twins, whereas the similarities on these X chromosomes were only found on identical twins who were heterosexual. Since then, they found genes on chromosome 8, 13, and 14, and maybe some others as well that I'm not aware of. Since then, they've been able to identify specific genes. We could probably teach a whole course on the different genes they have found and their roles in brain physiology and endocrinology. But what I would like you to know is that they have found regions on chromosomes and specific gene alleles that are more likely to be found in people who are homosexual, and chromosomal regions and gene alleles that are more likely to be found in heterosexual men. And then I think what I'd like to close with is this last point here, and that is that sexuality is complicated. We know that there are certain gene alleles that are more likely to be found in people who are homosexual, and certain alleles that are more likely to be found in people who are heterosexual. However, we also know that sometimes a person may have one of these genetic alleles that are more often found in homosexuals, but they are heterosexual. And sometimes you'll find somebody with one of those alleles that would suggest they might be heterosexual, but they are actually homosexual. And the reason for that is sexuality is complicated. It's not just one gene. It's a whole series of genes, some of which we know about and some of which we don't know about. We also know that there is an environmental link. And we haven't clearly identified what those could be. There are some suggestions out there, but we still don't know all of that. So we got a lot more to learn. However, what we can be sure of is that there is a genetic link and there is an environmental link to being homosexual or being heterosexual. The last thing I want to talk about under the large category of sexual development and identity is sex ratio. The sex ratio is the proportion of males to females. It's calculated by the number of males divided by the number of females. Now your book takes this number and multiplies it by 1,000, but you don't have to. I prefer just using the ratio here. So for instance, if it was a 1-to-1 ratio, right? If you had, say, 500 males to 500 females, that ratio would be 1.0. If you had 400 males to every 600 females, then that ratio would be 0.67. If you had 600 males to 400 females, that would be 1.5. If you multiply it by 1,000, like your book does, move the decimal point 3 places. Most places talk about it in this sense. So that's the way I'm going to present it. So as we look at these sex ratios, we can see some trends. We can see that if the sex ratio is greater than 1, then that means you will have more males. If it's less than 1, you will have more females. Typically, we think of sex ratio, and your book describes 3 levels to them: the primary sex ratio, the secondary sex ratio, and the tertiary sex ratio. Now, all of these will vary quite a bit, as there are various cultural reasons why the sex ratio could change. There are various environmental or disease factors that may affect men more predominantly or may affect women more predominantly. But let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about these. The primary sex ratio is at fertilization. You might think that this should be 1, but it turns out it's not. At fertilization, the sex ratio is 1.05. Again, you would think it would be 1 because you have roughly equal numbers of X and Y bearing sperm, and this is what's going to determine the sex of the individual. So you would think they would have equal chances of finding the oocyte. But it turns out that the Y-bearing sperms are a little faster. And so they're more likely to reach the oocyte faster than an X-bearing sperm. And the reason, at least the reason we hypothesize this, is that the Y chromosome is so much smaller than the X chromosome that it weighs less, and so it can simply swim a little faster. The secondary sex ratio is at birth. How many survive to birth? I see various numbers on these, but it's pretty close to 1.0, meaning roughly equal numbers of males and females. Tertiary sex ratio is the sex ratio at maturity, so after puberty. This starts off close to approximately 1.0, but as one ages, it goes to less than 1.0. And the reason for that is simply that women live longer than men for various reasons. Some studies have shown that that ratio is about 0.75, which means there are 750 men for every 1,000 women at age 65. Well, that's all I have for this podcast. In this podcast, we talked about various aspects of sexual development and sexual identity. For now, though, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. And if not, I will see you on the next podcast. Bye for now.